The Raven Guard in 40k are masters of swift and unseen assaults, reconnaissance and stealth troops who fall on the enemies of the Imperium without warning. And this was always the case, though in the early days of the Crusade, their shock assaults took on a much more terrifying form. Hiya, welcome to Heresy 101. In this little series, I'm going through the lore for each of Warhammer's Space Marine legions, particularly their origins in the grim days of the Horus Heresy. So I'll be taking a look at where they are at the start of the Heresy and how they got there, what happens to them during the Heresy, and therefore it's worth saying that this contains spoilers for many of the Heresy books, including the Black Library novel series. The 19th Legion were, for much of the Crusade, solid allies of the Warmaster Horus, fighting alongside his lunar wolves on warfronts across the galaxy. But with the discovery of their Primarch, the Legion's character was abruptly altered, and the Raven Guard at the end of the Crusade became priority targets for early elimination by the traitors. The history of the 19th Legion, like all the legions, starts during the Unification Wars on Terra. But more than many of the legions, their combat doctrines and idiosyncrasies were already highly evolved by the time the Legion left their homeworld. The initial recruits for the 19th were taken from the nomadic Xeric tribes of the Asiatic Dustfields, a people constantly at war amongst themselves and with the neighbouring Indonesic bloc. The tribes were known as being cruel and unrelenting fighters, ruthless and efficient, and a lot of this character made its way into the Legion. The 19th was the Emperor's hidden hand in these latter days of unification. Drawing on the demeanour of the techno-savages from which it recruited, the Proto-Legion quickly demonstrated its skill at reconnaissance and target identification, and its ability to transition from inscrutable watchfulness to rapid attack in the blink of an eye. This skill was put to use against some of the most horrific enemies of the early Imperium, including Callaghan of Ursh, whose generals were assassinated, and armies torn apart and enslaved in prison camps, to the Xenos invaders holed out on the Jovian moon of Lysithea. The warriors that survived these tense, dangerous deployments behind enemy lines emerged taciturn and brooding, separated forever by what they'd witnessed. As the Crusade pushed outwards, these qualities were favoured by Horus, the Primarch of the 16th Legion Lunar Wolves, and the much smaller 19th Legion served alongside them for many years. The skills of the 19th complemented the sudden, full-on strikes favoured by the Wolves, as the enemy would find their supply lines cut, their leaders assassinated, and any fugitives or survivors hunted down and watched over by brooding, black-eyed legionnaires. Their appearance, pale-skinned, black-haired, and with their faces smeared with war paint derived from the dustfields, along with their tendency to switch from watchfulness to total brutality in an instant, made them terrifying foes, and the Legion encouraged this reputation, descending unseen on their enemies, often before being ordered to do so. They became known as the Pale Nomads, or the Dust-Clad, amongst the armies of the Emperor. It's not too much of a stretch to say that for many years they were one of the terror weapons of the Imperium, concerned with swift compliance by whatever means necessary, and this reputation was solidified over almost 200 years of fighting. And it would prove a hard one to shake when the Legion were, finally, in the latter days of the Crusade, reunited with their Primarch. To create the 20 Legiones Astartes, the Emperor had first created 20 superhuman beings known as the Primarks, as the genetic templates and generals for his new armies. The Primarks were intended to lead the legions out from Terra on the Great Crusade, but near the end of the Unification Wars, as the Primarks grew in their incubation capsules and their genetic material was used to create the legions, a great catastrophe occurred and the 20 infant Primarks were scattered throughout the warp, coming to rest on various worlds across the galaxy. The pod of the 19th Primarch emerged deep inside the moon of Lycaeus and was discovered by some of the caste of slave miners that worked the moon, who raised him as one of their own. Named Corax, the Primarch was concealed from the mine overseers, something that was a great risk for the miners, but that Corax proved supernaturally good at. The moon was little more than a penal colony for the planet it orbited, Kievar, a world that had weathered the age of strife with much of its technology intact, and which was ruled over by tech guilds who had spent generations dumping their criminals and often political dissidents on the moon to mine its resources for them. Eventually, seeing the injustice all around him, the Primarch organised and then led an insurrection, overthrowing the overseers and leading his comrades in a swift and well-planned uprising against their masters. And it was just as this uprising was completed that the Imperium arrived. It's known that the Emperor and the Primarchs spoke, but unlike many other Primarchs, the Emperor did not immediately give Corax control of his legion. Instead, aware of the Primarch's plans to liberate his world, he left him in command of the stockpiles of atomic weapons the rulers of Kievar had hidden within the moon, and stood aside and watched as Corax used them to force the guilds to relinquish their rule. As the atomic fires blossomed on Kievar, Corax demonstrated that by slaying thousands, millions would be saved. This, some would later claim, was a lesson the Emperor meant Corax to learn. But whether Corax actually agreed with that lesson is unclear. Certainly when he took command of his legion, the Primarch acted swiftly to change those elements of its character he disagreed with. Like many legions, the 19th became a mix of the older, veteran Terran recruits and the new initiates raised from Kievar and its moon, now renamed Deliverance and rebuilt as the legion's base. It was during these early years that much of the native demeanour of the old 19th, in particular the cold-blooded ways of the Xeric tribes, were purged. The Legion had so often served in oppression, repression, and occupation forces that Corax saw in some of the Terrans something similar to the slavers of Lycaeus. Several of the Legion's highest-ranking officers were reassigned to garrisons, other fleets, or, like the former Legion Master, Shadelord Arcus Fall, to nomad predation fleets, assigned to patrol the unending sea of darkness at the edges of the Imperium, watching for extragalactic threats. This change in the Legion's culture would come to a head during the Battle of Gate 42 in the Achem Sothos cluster. Horus, now Warmaster, assembled elements of several legions to swiftly put an end to the rule of the unsighted kings who dominated the area. But unlike their previous assignments, the Warmaster ordered the Raven Guard to conduct a direct frontal assault on the enemy lines. Though Corax rallied against the plan, arguing that it was a waste of his legion's speciality, many of the remaining Terran legionnaires supported Horus, and so Corax assigned them to the attack. While the assault succeeded, the result was that Corax's new legion, now known as the Raven Guard, were decimated. After the battle, the Raven Guard could barely field 80,000 legionnaires, and Corax himself had sworn never to place himself under the Warmaster's command again, a decision that would prove prescient as the Horus Heresy unfolded. At the end of the Great Crusade, a few years later, their numbers having grown slightly, the Raven Guard could field around 81,000 legionnaires, around 1,000 of which were assigned on garrison duties, mostly in the Legion's home base of Deliverance. While the character of the old and new legions had never meshed well, their organisation structure and tactics had, and the Legion tended to operate a very loose chain of command. While it organised itself according to the Principia Bellicosa on paper, in reality individual companies and squad leaders had considerably more latitude than in other legions. Which spread all the way to the top. Corax himself had a much more casual and comradely relationship to his legionnaires than many other Primarchs. The Legion fielded every tool of war at the Imperium's disposal, including heavy tanks and artillery units, but nonetheless, the 19th favoured a style of war that focused on rapid strike, outflanking, mobility, and, where possible and desirable, stealth. They fielded large numbers of reconnaissance units, and the division between standard tactical squads and recon squads was often quite blurred, with both using a lot of the same tactics and equipment. They also had far higher numbers of Moritats than other legions, understandable when once their modus operandi had included assassination and infiltration. Their organisation also included a number of specialist formations, which used unique versions of equipment constructed by the guilds of Kievar, which, while not a Mechanicum Forge world, were comparable to one, and entirely under the control of the Legion. From war material like the Shadowhawk or Whisper Cutter, to being the testbed for the advanced Mark VI Corvus armour, the Legion was one of the more technologically advanced ones. But none of this famed stealth technology would prove much use in their opening engagement of the Heresy. As Horus's rebellion was revealed in the Istvan system, the Imperium responded by deploying 7 legions to Istvan V to halt Horus's advance. The first 3 legions to arrive, the Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands, deployed immediately to the surface on the order of Ferrus Manus of the 10th. but were caught in a brutal crossfire when the remaining 4 Loyalist legions deployed as a second wave, declared for Horus, and cut down their allies. The Raven Guard were all but destroyed. Corax and the survivors went into hiding on the surface for months before a small fleet, braving the blockade around the planet, managed to extract them. Barely 4,000 of the Legion remained, many joining the guerrilla forces known as the Shattered Legions, where their skills in stealth assault proved invaluable in harrying the Warmaster's forces during their long march on Terra. But Corax himself wanted to make a greater stand against the betrayal. Petitioning the Emperor on Terra, he gained access to secret assets from the original Astartes creation process, and along with help from the Mechanicum and the scientific knowledge of the guilds of Kievar, he used this genetic material in an attempt to hothouse his legion back to fighting strength. But the Raven Guard had been infiltrated by the traitor Alpha Legion during the flight from Istvan, and as the project unfolded, they fomented rebellion amongst the guilds and tainted the rescued gene stocks, so the Astartes created from them were malformed, many of them so mutated they could barely hold a bolt gun. Though some of them were later able to fight alongside the Legion, Corax was forced to stop the project, and the Raven Guard would never rebuild their numbers, though they continued to fight valiantly for the Loyalists, cutting supply lines, stalling advances, and generally being a thorn in the Warmaster's side, until he finally reached Terra. And that's the 19th Legion, originally one of the Emperor's more terrible weapons, transformed by the Primarch that inherited them into noble freedom fighters through the exile of its Terran members. But the subsequent lack of numbers meant they were easy prey for the traitors on Istvan, and were never able to rebuild again. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed that, well, there should be another little video coming up on the right there. And if you'd like to support the channel, there's a link to the Patreon in the thing below. See ya.